I'd like to start by saying that for over 20 years I was a British diplomat. I spoke on behalf of the UK at many fora of the United Nations. I ultimately became a British ambassador, and I resigned from my diplomatic career over the invasion of Iraq and the torture and extraordinary rendition in which the UK state was complicit, and which I saw from the inside. So I have a personal experience of the dark side of the continuing imperial pretensions of the state of the United Kingdom. Since then, I've actually spoken at the United Nations in fora like this on many occasions. I've spoken on torture and extraordinary rendition. I've spoken on behalf of Julian Assange. I've spoken on Palestine. The last time I spoke at the UN was actually in favour of the colonised people of New Caledonia. And this is the first time at any forum within a United Nations building I've spoken for my own people. So for me, as a Scot, this is a profoundly moving experience for me. I'm just briefly going to show you my costume, which Scotland was an independent nation state. Scotland was actually one of the very first nation states in the world, one of the first nation states in Europe. It was an independent nation state with its own status and international agreements for over 800 years before it was colonised by England. It has been part of the United Kingdom for only 300 years. It existed as a nation state much longer than it's been colonised. And as for being a people of our own culture, all I can say to you is that as I walked here, not only did I have to stop 100 times for selfies of people who wanted to be photographed with me, but everybody knew I was Scottish, because people know our national culture. The existence of Scottish national culture and heritage is not in dispute. It's a fact. It's a fact of history. But one fact you may not know is that for 70 years, for dressing as I am dressed today, would be transported as a slave. It was illegal to wear the tartan in Scotland for 70 years. And that was part of the colonisation process. My ancestors are from Blair Athol in the Highlands. If you walk today from Blair Athol to Braemar at 60 miles along an old track, you'll pass through the ruins of 12 towns which were destroyed. And it is now an absolute wilderness. And you'll be walking on a road that was a public highway and a major highway in the Highlands, and which is now not a road at all. It's a path, and there's no public right-of-way. It's part of a private estate. And if you look at a map of Scotland, you'll see this vast area of the Scottish Highlands, which is just blank, with no roads passing through it, and no towns and no villages. And people assume it's some vast mountainous wilderness. It's not. It's actually good, fertile land. And the population was dispossessed and cleared away. When I campaigned for Scottish independence in the referendum of 2014, even talking in Glasgow or Edinburgh, the thing which resonated most with the ordinary Scottish people in the audience was when I spoke of our dispossession from our land, because people still remember and still understand. And I know that many colonial people have that in their heritage. Now I want to look forward. We've heard a lot about the past, but I want to talk about Scottish independence and what it will mean. And one thing I'll say to you is I am happily convinced that Scottish independence is inevitable. 8 of the last 10 opinion polls, it's something which is polled very regularly by all the major polling organisations. 8 of the last 10 opinion polls have shown a majority for Scottish independence. Among people under the age of 30, that majority is generally 70 to 75%. Young people overwhelmingly support Scottish independence. And the only demographic which shows support for the continuation of the United Kingdom is the over 50s. And that's part of the reason why the opinion polls have inexorably trended towards independence, because young Scots want independence. And those who were the generation which was propagandized into support for the United Kingdom is falling. And thankfully, the world has changed, and we no longer are confined to media propaganda. People are learning the truth. They're learning the truth about history. You're still not taught it at school. The version of imperial history you are taught at school is still full of lies and misrepresentations. But people are learning the truth for themselves. And so we have an inexorable trend. I need to address the fact we had a referendum in 2014, because that's important. At the time that referendum was granted, the opinion polls showed support for Scottish independence, depending on which poll you looked at, between 28% and 32%. We had a quite brief referendum campaign. In the course of that campaign, support for independence rose from 28% to 45% on polling day in just a few months. And that was because the course of that campaign was perhaps the first time that a great many Scots had ever heard the arguments in favour of independence. I can also say to you, and of this I'm quite sure, that the British state only agreed to have a referendum because support was at 28%. They thought it would kill Scottish independence forever. They thought we would get a humiliatingly bad result. In fact, we got 45%, and they were terrified. But the point I want to make to you, which I think is the most important, and I should say on behalf of the British government, I have monitored elections abroad in more than one country. None of the conditions of that referendum would meet international standards for a free and fair referendum. In particular, massive media bias, particularly by the BBC, which is the main news source. But the media bias of the BBC during the referendum campaign was absolutely off the scale. And there was no international monitoring at all. When has there ever been a referendum on national independence of any colony where international observers were not permitted or invited? There were none. There was zero international monitoring. You can't look and see what does the OSCE say about media bias, because the OSCE were not there. There was no international monitoring of any stage. We had a lot of very peculiar things happen. We had, in some areas, we had 99% of people voting, which is physically impossible because the electoral registers are always about 18 months old and more than 1% of people will have died. We had counts where fire alarms went off repeatedly and people had to evacuate during the count. We had ballot papers sent to England for counting. We had numerous extraordinary irregularities, although of all, as I say, the media bias, the constant and total media bias was the biggest single irregularity. But it's also the case that that was 2014 and this is 2025. And remember, Scotland's only a nation of 6 million people altogether, including children. There are now 1 million voters who were too young to vote in 2014 who now have a vote. And those voters are overwhelmingly pro-independence. And the British government will not allow another referendum. The Scottish government, and this is something I'll come on to, the Scottish government has repeatedly asked for another referendum. And a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament has been elected. Every Parliament for the last 18 years in Scotland has had a pro-independence majority. But the English government will not permit another referendum because they know they would lose, bluntly. And they're not going to permit another. They're on record as saying definitively that Scotland will not be allowed another referendum, full stop, because they can't afford to lose our resources. You know, most people don't realise Scotland actually has more oil and gas than Norway. We had more before and we have more left. And we only have 6 million people. Scotland is self-sufficient in food. Scotland produces more renewable energy alone, already produced in Scotland. It's 3 times Scottish energy consumption. And it's all sent, as we heard earlier, to England, and we get nothing for it. We literally get nothing for it. Multinational corporations own it, get money. Taxation on their profits goes to England. It goes there. They're building massive pipelines to take yet more of our water down to England, for which we get nothing. Independence is going to come. Now, an independent Scotland will be very different to England. I know I look terribly young, but I'm not a young man. In my lifetime, in no election has Scotland ever voted Conservative. There has never been a Conservative majority elected in any election in Scotland in my lifetime. Yet most of my lifetime we've had to suffer Conservative governments. At the moment we have a Conservative government pretending not to be a Conservative government. But Scotland is a country with very strong socialist and social democratic roots. And the views of an independent Scotland will be very, very different to the views of England. And again, you can see it in opinion polling. And we heard earlier about Palestine action, and I should be open with you. I'm a terrorist. I have been arrested for terrorism, for supporting Palestine. I am still under investigation for terrorism, for expressing support for the right of the Palestinian people to armed resistance. That, just expressing that support in the eyes of the British government is an act of terrorism. And yet in Scotland, all opinion polls show a minimum of 80% of the Scottish people support Palestine rather than Israel. And our own Scottish government, 2 weeks ago, voted for a complete boycott of Israel for any activity controlled by the Scottish government. So that includes Scottish universities, Scottish schools, that includes Scottish investments. Anything the Scottish government controls will boycott Israel. And yet we have a government in Westminster which is using armed forces paid for by my taxes to provide targeting information from overflights of Gaza to the Israeli Defence Force. Scotland will be very different. Scotland will be politically and in international law and in international relations. Scotland will be very similar to where Ireland is. Ireland is our sister nation, and we have similar culture, related languages, similar background. The United Kingdom will be fundamentally weakened by the departure of Scotland. And I say to you, if you are a citizen of this world, the weakening of the United Kingdom is something you could welcome, because the United Kingdom has been a force for evil in this world for a long time. And here's an important point. I've never written a speech in my life. I always just talk extempore, and I am. And I've even forgotten what the title of this was supposed to be. But it was something about the legal consequences and comparison. There is a big question. As I say to you, Scottish independence will come. It is unstoppable. What then happens to the United Kingdom? Is England accepted by the international community as a successor state? It's an interesting question. That Russia was accepted as the successor state of the Soviet Union, for example. But in doing that, Russia assumed, for example, all of the national debt of the Soviet Union. And the English have made very plain. They made plain at the time of the last referendum that should Scotland vote for independence, they would refuse to accept the national debt. Well, in that case, we refuse to accept they are the successor state. And this is very important within the United Nations, because one of the things which is paralyzing international action on the genocide in Gaza is the outdated constitution of the United Nations. The fact that you have the 5 victors of the Second World War established there as permanent members of the Security Council. You have a country like the United Kingdom, which is a faded power and just really a kind of sidekick to the United States, on the Security Council with veto, and nobody can do anything about it. Well, if the United Kingdom ceases to exist, there is your wedge to do something about it. Because why would you accept England as a permanent member of the Security Council? That's even more ludicrous than having the United Kingdom as a permanent member of the Security Council. The independence of Scotland is going to be a wedge which opens up a huge number of international issues which are blocked by the existence of the United Kingdom. It's hard to know. I can't bind the Scottish people. I don't know, in an independent Scotland, how they will vote, what they will do. The UK's nuclear weapons. The UK has just, in the last 3 months, imported new nuclear weapons from the United States, which are now based in the south in Lakenheath and Mildenhall, which are aircraft carried. But the United States' main, and until recently only, nuclear deterrent is based in Scotland and could not be based anywhere else. The only place that can house the Trident missiles is in Faslane, in Holyloch, in Scotland, which is a short distance from Glasgow. And interestingly enough, the reason it is housed officially in Holyloch is because there's not a major population there. What they mean is it's only Scots that would get killed, which they really don't mind so much. But on the Ukrainian precedent, when the Soviet Union dissolved, the nuclear weapons which were in Ukraine were not handed to Russia. They were dismantled by the United Nations, by the international community. And I think that, for me, is another blessing. For me, an independent Scotland, because all of the political parties, except the Conservative Party that nobody votes for, in Scotland, 82% of the parties voted for in Scotland are anti-nuclear, in terms of the votes cast. An independent Scotland could call in the dismantlement of the nuclear weapon fleet of the United Kingdom. That would be another great peace advantage. I also believe we would see Scottish forces deployed as UN peacekeeping forces as opposed to forces of imperial foreign intervention as they were in Iraq and Libya and so many other places. Scottish independence is, of course, important. It's vital for the people of Scotland because the poverty in Scotland is heartbreaking. We have people who can't afford to feed their children properly in Scotland, in a country of so much wealth. But it's also vital because it's going to be transformative for the world and of benefit to a great many people who are not Scots at all. Thank you.